So welcome to Lesson 4. Given a scenario, analyze potential indicators associated with network attacks. In sub-lesson 4.1, we're going to be talking about digital infrastructure attacks. Now, the objective of digital infrastructure attacks is the disruption, manipulation, or compromise of IT, information technology, or OT, operational technology systems. Now, I know you're all extremely familiar with what IT is, but perhaps not as familiar with OT, so let's define that. OT, or operational technology, can be hardware or software that controls physical devices or processes in specific environments, such as buildings, facilities, and utilities. Perhaps it's the elevator or the machines on the factory floor. As automation becomes more and more embedded in our environment, operational technology attacks are definitely on the rise. Now, there are 4 cyber attack terms I want you to know: a targeted attack, an opportunistic attack, an amplification attack, and a zero-day attack. Now, a targeted attack is when the attacker chooses a target for a specific objective. They're going after that target, they know what they want, and they're going to go for it. In an opportunistic attack, the attacker takes advantage of a target who's vulnerable. They may not have been previously known to them, but what they've done is identified a vulnerability or weakness, and they know they can probably be successful in their attack against that particular target. An amplification attack is when an attacker uses an amplification factor to multiply its power. And a zero-day attack is when the attacker exploits a vulnerability for which there's not a fix yet available. So targeted attack, opportunistic attack, amplification attack, and zero-day attack. These terms are going to come up multiple times over our course. Now, there are 4 digital attack categories you need to be familiar with: spoofing, poisoning, hijacking, and a denial of service. Spoofing is impersonating an address, a system, or a person. That enables the attacker to act as the trusted source and redirect or manipulate actions. Poisoning is actually manipulating the trusted source of data. For example, DNS zone files, or a routing table, or an ARP cache, enabling an attacker to control the trusted source of data and redirect or manipulate actions. Hijacking is intercepting communication between 2 or more systems, enabling the attacker to perhaps eavesdrop or capture or manipulate or even reuse data packets. And lastly, a denial of service is the overwhelming of system resources that enables an attacker to make services available for its intended use. So let's dive deeper into each one of these. Spoofing, we said, was impersonating an address, system, or person. There are 2 attacks I want you to be able to recognize: IP address spoofing and MAC, media access control, address spoofing. In an IP address spoofing, maybe the attacker will use a known trusted IP address for authentication or response, or use a fake IP address to disguise the sender. In a MAC address spoofing attack, well, our attacker might use a known trusted MAC address for access, use a known trusted MAC address to circumvent licensing, or use a fake MAC address to mask the identity of a device. So know these 2, IP address spoofing and MAC address spoofing. Poisoning is manipulating or altering the actual trusted source of data, enabling an attacker to control the trusted source of data and redirect or manipulate actions. Now, 2 attacks I want you to be familiar with: ARP cache poisoning and DNS cache poisoning. We use ARP, which is Address Resolution Protocol, to translate or map a MAC address to an IP address. ARP cache poisoning attacks would include using a poisoned ARP cache to redirect traffic to a malicious host, or using a poisoned ARP cache even to stop traffic. Now, a DNS is used to resolve a host or domain name to an IP address. DNS cache poisoning might be used to divert website traffic to a malicious site, or to divert website traffic to a non-existing site, to deadhole it. So make sure you know these 2: ARP cache poisoning, DNS cache poisoning. Our 3rd category is hijacking. That's intercepting communications between 2 systems. 3 that I want you to know: a man in the middle, a man in the browser, and session hijacking. A man in the middle attack might use spoofing, poisoning, or both. But the key is that a man-in-the-middle attack is exploiting the real-time processing of transactions, conversations, or data transfer. A man-in-the-browser attack is really just an internet version of a man-in-the-middle. It's manipulating the browser to control a session of what's being displayed. Both man-in-the-middle and man-in-the-browser attacks are also known as on-path attacks. So make sure you know man-in-the-middle, man-in-the-browser, and the fact that they're both known as on-path attacks. Lastly is session hijacking, and that's stealing cookies to take over a user's active session. Now there's some hijacking that are very specific to domains and websites. Domain hijacking, URL squatting, and typo squatting. Domain hijacking is the unauthorized modification of a domain name registration with the goal of taking over a legitimate website for malicious purposes. URL squatting is registering or using an internet domain name belonging to someone else. The goal, to direct users to a fraudulent site that looks familiar. And typo squatting is taking advantage of typos to create fraudulent websites. We all go to google.com, Google. What if there's an extra O? Google. Could be a common typo, redirects to the fraudulent site. That's also referred to as URL redirection. So make sure you know domain hijacking, URL squatting, and typo squatting, and also known as URL redirection. Now, our last type of attack that we're going to talk about is denial of service. That's overwhelming system resources so they're unavailable for their intended use. Two types, denial of service and distributed denial of service. A denial of service happens when the attacker will either transmit malformed packets or unusual requests, with the goal of shutting down a specific service or resource. A distributed denial of service is a massive attack. It's a massive volume of service requests from multiple sources. Those sources are known as zombies or bots. They have little pieces of code that are directing them to do this. And when we have all these bots or zombies that are controlled by a single attacker, they're referred to as a botnet. Now the goal is to shut down a resource and or deny service to legitimate users. It can also cause downstream degradation of the systems that have been compromised to use in the attack. So denial of service and distributed denial of service. And I just want to give you a visualization of a distributed denial of service attack. We have our attacker and their controller system, and all of these zombies or bots have been compromised, and they're under the control of the controller and the attacker. They've either been pre-programmed instructions or given instructions at a certain time to attack our victim. With such massive, massive volume, so many requests that it overwhelms the victim system and crashes it, shuts it right down. And because there's so much activity going on in the botnet, sometimes we'll actually see problems right in here with the systems that are actually doing the attacking. So that brings us to a 3-second challenge. You ready? You know the drill. 5 challenge questions, 3 seconds each. Let's go. Challenge 1. Impersonating an address, system, or purpose. What's this type of attack called? 1, 2, 3. Spoofing. Challenge 2. Manipulating a trusted source of data. 1, 2, 3. Poisoning. Challenge 3. Intercepting communications between 2 or more systems. You know this one, I'm sure you do. 1, 2, 3. Hijacking. Challenge 4. An attack designed to overwhelm system resources. 1, 2, 3. It's the one I just showed you. It's a denial of service known as a DOS, or if you had said a distributed denial of service, DDoS, that would have worked too. And our last challenge question. Manipulating the browser to control a session, including what's displayed. 1, 2, 3. Man in the browser, also known as a MIP, also known as an on-path attack. That brings us to our security in action. This one's about a cyber attack. A hacktivist group initiated a 0-day poisoning attack on your company's DNS server, which resulted in traffic being redirected to a competitor in an endless loop. The competitor site was unable to handle the traffic and subsequently crashed. Post-incident, you're writing up an assessment, And you want to include a preface that includes a brief incident synopsis. But your audience isn't technical. How would you explain what happened? Let's dissect this a little bit. So we were attacked by a hacktivist group. It was a 0-day poisoning attack on your company's DNS server, which resulted in traffic being redirected in this crazy endless loop, which caused our competitor's site to crash. It also caused traffic to move away from our site. So how are we going to explain this? Well, let's start from the very beginning. What's a hacktivist group? What's 0-day? What's poisoning? What do we use DNS for? What does it mean that the system crashed? Who were the victims? You may begin by explaining that hacktivists are cyber adversaries whose motivation is generally political. A 0-day attack exploits a vulnerability for which a fix is not yet available. Poisoning is the manipulation of trusted data. In this case, the Internet Locator record was changed to point from www.ourcompany.com to www.competitorcompany.com. Now, the increase in traffic was intended to consume their resources and cause a denial of service. That's why they crashed. But in the end, both companies were victimized. Our company was victimized because customers were led away from our system. Our competitor was victimized because their system crashed. Bad stuff. But being able to explain this in plain language to a non-technical audience, that, my friends, is security in action. So ending with the word cloud, you know the drill. Put me on pause, go through these terms, make sure you can use them, that you understand them, talk about them in context, teach them to somebody else. If you can do all that, well, you're ready to move on. If not, go back to the lesson again. And when you're ready, I'll be waiting in the next lesson.